The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day that smells like iron and wood smoke and the particular loneliness of a season changing its mind. Violet Slade was 22 years old when she read it, standing in the doorway of the cottage she had shared with her great-uncle for the past 4 years. The paper trembling slightly in her hands, though whether from the wind coming off Lake Temiskaming or from something else entirely, she could not have said. The letter was from a man named Reginald Oakes, solicitor, whose address was printed at the top in a font meant to convey authority. He represented the estate of one Gordon Martin Slade, deceased, Violet's great-uncle, the man who had taken her in at 18, when her mother died, and left her with nothing but a sewing box and a surname. The letter informed her, in language that was both precise and utterly airless, that the property at 14 Larch Shore Road, Cobalt Township, Ontario, had been held in common with a secondary heir, one Dale Oakes, nephew of the solicitor, and it turned out, longtime creditor of Gordon Slade, and that upon Gordon's death, the debt attached to the property had come due immediately. The cottage, the letter said, was to be vacated within 21 days. A courtesy payment of $180 had been arranged for the inconvenience of her relocation. We think about that word sometimes. Inconvenience, as though what Violet was being handed was a delayed train, a misplaced parcel, as though 4 years of a life could be measured in $180, and an apology no one had the nerve to deliver in person. She folded the letter along its original crease and slipped it into the pocket of her canvas apron. She looked out past the narrow porch to the lake, which was gray and flat and indifferent. The birches along the water had already gone bare. Gordon had taught her the name of every tree on this shoreline. He had taught her a great many things, most of them with his hands rather than his words. She did not cry. She had learned, in the years since her mother's death, to treat grief as something to be done in private, the way you mend a tear in a seam, carefully, in good light, when no one is watching. There was work to do. There was always work to do. We should tell you something about Violet Slade before we go any further, because this story is not simply about what was taken from her. It is about what she already had that no one had thought to take. Gordon Martin Slade had been, in the estimation of the township, an eccentric. He had retired from the Canadian Pacific Railway at 63 after 28 years, as a millwright, a man who built and repaired the great mill mechanisms that processed the timber and ore of northern Ontario. He was not a warm man in the conventional sense. He did not hug easily or speak at length about feelings, but he was a man of extraordinary precision and patience. And when Violet arrived on his doorstep in late October 4 years ago, thin-shouldered and frightened, and carrying everything she owned in a canvas duffel bag, he had looked at her for a long moment and then said, simply, "You had better come in." He had put her to work immediately, not out of cruelty, but because he understood instinctively that the best thing for a person who has lost their footing is something useful to do with their hands. Within her first week, he had her helping him true a set of hand planes he was restoring for a local craftsman. She had no idea what she was doing. He showed her, without impatience, and she did it again until it was right. Over 4 years, without ever calling it an apprenticeship, Gordon Slade had made her one. She could read a piece of lumber the way some people read a face, for its grain, its tension, the story of what it had been before it was cut. She could sharpen a blade to a mirror edge and knew the difference between a tool that was dull and a tool that was improperly pitched. She could join 2 pieces of wood so cleanly that the seam nearly disappeared. She understood the mechanics of load and stress, of moisture movement, of how a structure breathes and settles over time. None of this was accidental. Gordon had placed the knowledge in her hands deliberately, systematically, over 4 quiet years on the shore of Temiskaming. When he died in September, a heart attack, sudden and without theater, on a Thursday morning while he was sharpening a draw knife in the workshop, she had sat with his body for a long time before calling anyone. She had not known then what she was losing beyond the man himself. She had not known that the letter was coming. She knew now. That evening, Violet sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pencil and set down the facts of her life as they currently stood. It was something Gordon had taught her too. Before you solve a problem, you have to know its actual dimensions. On one side of the page, she wrote what she had. The $180 from the estate, though she had not yet decided whether she would take it. Her own savings, accumulated from 4 years of taking in small woodworking repairs for neighbors, sharpening, small furniture fixes, a new set of cabinet hinges fitted and hung. That came to $63.40. She had Gordon's tools. Not all of them. The letter had been clear that the workshop contents were considered part of the estate, but the ones he had designated hers, formally, in a handwritten note he had left with Violet herself rather than the solicitor. 7 tools in total, a number 4 bench plane, a set of chisels, 8 of them, wrapped in canvas, a combination square, a marking gauge wooden-bodied, made by Gordon himself from a piece of cherry wood, a small rip saw, a brace and a single bit, and a folding rule, worn smooth at the hinges from years of use, with Gordon's initials scratched faintly into the brass face. She owned a bicycle, good enough for the roads around here. Her clothes, a box of books. These were the material facts. On the other side of the page, she wrote her liabilities. At the top, 21 days. Below that, November in northern Ontario. Cobalt Township was not a forgiving place to be homeless in November. The temperature in January regularly fell to 30 below and stayed there for weeks. Boarding houses in Cobalt were full of mining company workers. A room in New Liskeard might be found for $18 or $20 a month, but that was without meals, and her money would be gone by March. She had no family left. A cousin in Sudbury she had not spoken to in years. No one in this township who would take her in, not for a full winter. She could try to find work. She was competent with her hands in ways that most people around here associated with men. The lumber yards, the mine operations. They hired women for some things, domestic things, cleaning and cooking. She was capable of that work, but it would leave her tools in a bag under a cot in someone else's building, and something in her, she could not name it precisely, only feel its outline, would not permit that. She had not spent 4 years becoming who she was in order to put her hands to work she was not meant for. The arithmetic was unforgiving. Her options, assembled by conventional thinking, led nowhere she could bear to go. She looked out the window at the dark shape of the workshop across the yard. The light from the kitchen made a yellow square on the frozen ground. In 3 weeks, none of this would be hers. She pulled Gordon's folding rule from her apron pocket. She had taken to carrying it there, these past weeks, the way you keep a hand on something you are not ready to put down. She turned it over in her fingers. The brass catch clicked softly. Something moved in her thinking. She went to Gordon's shelf, which she had not yet boxed up, and ran her fingers along the spines of his reference texts until she found what she was looking for. A technical manual, government printed, from 1947, on the construction of rural outbuildings. Gordon had marked pages throughout it in his small, angular script. She had read some of these passages before, sitting in the workshop while he worked, when she was still learning how to be still in the same room as another person's concentration. She opened it to a tabbed page near the back. Gordon's note in the margin said simply, Hartwell Road site, viable for a shop, winter ready if done right. The entry he had marked described a particular kind of structure. A post and beam outbuilding, designed for harsh climate, using materials that could be sourced from the land itself, with a stove installation and a trench foundation that would stay dry even through the freeze-thaw cycles of a northern spring. Beside the text in the same penciled hand, he had added a small sketch, a rectangular floor plan, a note about south-facing orientation, an arrow pointing to where a forge or workbench would sit. And beneath that, in handwriting, she had to lean close to read, because it was faint and had been written quickly, as though as an afterthought. The Hartwell Road property belongs to no one now, has for years. Crown land, reverted 1961. A building put up with good materials and honest use. No one troubles that. Violet sat back in her chair. She read the note again. Gordon had not been writing a plan. He had been making an observation, a millwright's note on the properties of a situation. He could not have known. He had been in good health. He had not anticipated any of this, that he was leaving her a map. But that is exactly what it was. She held the open book in her lap and felt something shift in her chest. The fear that had been sitting there since the letter arrived, cold and solid and very much shaped like a fist, did not vanish, but it changed. It became something narrower and more useful, something she could work with. She would not go to New Liskeard. She would not take a room in a boarding house and put her tools in a bag under a cot. She would take her $180 and her $63 and her dead uncle's 7 tools, and she would build something. She would go to Hartwell Road. She would do what Gordon had taught her, with the knowledge Gordon had left her, in the place Gordon, without ever saying so, had pointed her toward. She would build her workshop, and she would survive the winter in it. The following morning, Violet rode her bicycle to Cobalt proper, along the road that edged the lake, the air so cold it made her eyes water. She went first to the hardware supplier, a man named Earl Price. Not the Earl Price who ran the pharmacy, but the other one, the older one, whose shop smelled of raw timber and linseed oil, and had not been modernized since approximately 1953, which was part of why Violet liked it. Earl Price did not believe in wasting words on anything that could be communicated by silence and a raised eyebrow. He had been a friend of Gordon's in the same uncomplicated way that men of a certain generation were friends. Through proximity, through mutual respect for competent work, through occasional arguments about the correct way to true a saw set, he had attended the funeral. He had said nothing to Violet beyond "I'm sorry for your loss," which was exactly the right amount. She walked in, the bell above the door sounding, and put her written list on the counter without preamble. He read it without expression. The list included 20 feet of 6x6 spruce posts, rough cut, enough 2x6 framing lumber for a 16x20-foot structure, a bundle of cedar shingles, 1 case of number 12 framing nails, 2 boxes of number 8 screws, a roll of building wrap, a small cast-iron wood stove, the Vogelzang box stove if he had one, 15 feet of single-wall stovepipe and an elbow, 50 pounds of quick-setting mortar, a window, single pane, 12 by 18 inches, and a door. The plainest one he had used was fine. He looked up from the list. He looked at her face. He was a man who had spent his working life assessing materials, their integrity, their grain, whether they would hold. He applied the same eye to Violet Slade now, and appeared to find her satisfactory. "What's this for?" he said. It was not quite a question, she told him. Not everything. The essentials. The Hartwell Road site, the Crown land, Gordon's note. The fact that she needed to be out of the cottage in 18 days. He set the list down on the counter and was quiet for a moment. "The lumber'll run you $210, he said. Stove $65. Hardware and wrap and pipe, call it another $40. The door, I've got a used one in the back, $12. Windows $9, $336 in total. More than the entirety of what she had. She had known this was a possibility. She had not let herself flinch from it. "I have $243, she said. "And I have Gordon's tools, which between them are worth more than that, but they are not for sale. I can offer you the $243 now, and the remainder before April." He looked at the list again, then at her. "Gordon Slade trained you," he said. "He did." He nodded, once slowly, in the manner of a man making a decision he has already arrived at. He wrote something on the bottom of her list, a figure, a date, the word balance, and pushed it back across the counter. He then went into the back of the shop and returned with a heavy canvas tarp, folded thick. He set it on the counter beside the list. "For the roof, while you get the shingles up," he said. "No charge." He paused. Then he picked up a folded piece of paper from beside the register and added it to the small pile. "Survey map of the Hartwell Road area. Gordon gave it to me 20 years ago. Thought I might build something up there myself. Never did." Violet looked at him. "He was a good man," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. "Knew what he was doing," Earl Price replied, in a tone that suggested this was the highest form of praise he was aware of, which is more than most. He wrote up the invoice. His son would truck the materials to the end of Hartwell Road that afternoon. She walked out into the bright cold of the morning with a survey map in her pocket and a receipt in her hand, and the particular feeling of someone who has just committed to something irreversible. Good, she thought. She could not afford to turn back now. "We want you to understand what the next 26 days actually meant, because it is easy, at this distance, to summarize them. To say she built her workshop and call that sufficient. But we think you deserve to know what it costs to build something with your own 2 hands, in the cold, against a deadline, alone. It costs more than you expect, and it is also more than you expect." Violet arrived at the Hartwell Road site on a Thursday morning with her bicycle, her tools in a pack strapped to the rear rack, a bedroll, and 5 days of food. The site was a roughly level clearing at the end of a 2-track road, cut through second-growth spruce, oriented south, with a natural windbreak of mature balsam fir along the north edge. Gordon's sketch had not been wrong about it. The ground was not yet frozen hard, which was the first piece of luck she allowed herself to acknowledge. She began with the trench foundation as the manual described. A shallow perimeter trench filled with a gravel and mortar mix that would drain properly and resist frost heave. She had borrowed a post-hole auger from a neighbor before leaving the cottage. She spent the first 3 days on foundation work alone. Her hands, already calloused from years of tool work, developed new textures. Her shoulders ached in a way that went past muscle and seemed to settle into something deeper. She slept in the canvas tarp, rigged between 2 trees, her bedroll on a layer of spruce boughs, the small camping stove she'd borrowed from the cottage, propped on a flat rock beside her. She woke before dawn each morning because the cold made sleeping past a certain hour impossible, and because there was no time to spare. The post and beam frame went up over 5 days. This was the work she was most uncertain about. Not the joinery, which she understood, but the matter of raising the posts and beams alone, without another pair of hands, to hold things vertical while she plumbed and fixed them. She solved this the way Gordon had taught her to solve structural problems, by thinking about what the problem actually was, rather than what she assumed it was. The problem was not that she had no helper. The problem was that she had no way to hold a post in plumb while she worked. She built a series of simple bracing jigs from scrap lumber, temporary triangular props, pinned at the base with steel stakes, that held each post vertical while she fastened it. It was slow. It worked. Each evening she stood back and looked at the structure she had made, and the small sound it made in the wind, the creak and tick of new wood settling, was the best sound she had heard in months. She had not wept since the letter arrived. She came close, on the 9th evening, not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming competence. A feeling she had no name for, the feeling of understanding completely that you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were built to do. She sat on a stack of lumber with Gordon's folding rule in her hand, and let the feeling pass through her until it steadied into something quieter and more permanent. The walls were framed and sheathed in building wrap by the 14th day. The cedar shingles went on over the next 4. She had shimmed the window opening with a care that Gordon would have approved of, and fitted the used door on a set of hinges she had brought from the cottage, the same hinges she had hung on silver 2 years prior, when the original ones rusted through. The stove was the most technically demanding task. She sited it on a raised mortar hearth, 3 courses of brick she had salvaged from a collapsed barn foundation she had passed on Hartwell Road. She ran the single-wall pipe through the wall with a proper clearance collar, then switched to double wall for the exterior run, and capped it with a rain cap she fashioned from a piece of galvanized flashing. The first fire she lit, dry spruce, the kind that catches fast and burns clean, drew perfectly. The smoke went up the way it was supposed to, and the small iron box began to tick and glow, and the air in the unfinished workshop shifted from the damp cold of raw lumber to something that was not yet warm, but was no longer indifferent. On the 23rd day it was done. She had a floor, walls, a roof, a door that closed flush, a window that let in the southern light, and a stove that worked. She had 4 cords of split firewood stacked against the interior north wall, cut from the deadfall on the site. She had a workbench, built from 2 spruce planks on sawhorses for now, but solid, and her 7 tools arranged on it in the order she always arranged them. She stood in the center of the space and turned a slow circle. The afternoon light came through the south-facing window and lay in a precise rectangle on the fresh-swept floor. Outside, the first real snow of the season had begun to fall, quiet and without urgency. She had not been given a new beginning. She had built one. News of what Violet Slade had done moved through Cobalt Township the way news moves in small places, not quickly, but thoroughly, following the lines of existing relationship and mutual interest. Earl Price mentioned it to 2 people. Those 2 people mentioned it to others. By the time the first deep cold settled over the lake in December, the woman who had been turned out of her home was not a figure of pity. She was a topic of considerable local attention. The first person to make the trip out Hartwell Road was a man named Bernard Quill, who ran the small furniture repair shop on Ferguson Street and had more work coming in than his aging hands could manage. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a ladder-back chair that needed its seat re-rushed, a dovetail drawer front that had split along an old glue line, and a general air of cautious curiosity. He stopped in the doorway of the workshop and looked around at it the way Earl Price had looked at her list, with the eyes of a man who understood what he was seeing. "You built this yourself," he said. "I did." He came inside. He set the chair and the drawer front on her workbench. He examined her tool layout without touching anything. He looked at the stove installation and the hearth she had mortared, and the way the door hung in its frame. He had the manner of someone conducting an inspection he hadn't expected to take seriously, and now found himself taking very seriously indeed. He left her the 2 repair jobs. He paid her $7 for the work when she finished it 2 days later, which was a fair price. Then he sent his neighbor, who had a cabinet with a broken hinge rail. Then the neighbor's wife came with a cradle that needed a spindle replaced. Then a man from the north end of town arrived with a set of hand planes, 3 of them, badly rusted and without their blades, and asked if she could restore them. She could. She did. She charged fairly for everything, kept a record in a notebook Gordon had given her, and told no one how close the margins were. Her first month's income from the workshop, after setting aside money for Earl Price balance, was $62. In February, it was $90. By March, she had paid the remaining debt to Earl Price in full and had a waiting list. She also began doing what Clara Holloway had done before her, in a different cold and a different century, though Violet Slade had never heard of her. When people came to her with questions, about wood, about tools, about how to fix a thing rather than replace it, she answered, fully, practically, without condescension. A retired teacher named Paulette Auger came out on a Saturday in January, wanting to learn how to sharpen a handsaw. Violet showed her, explained the principles, let her do it herself until she had the feel of it. A teenage boy named Wesley came several times over the winter, ostensibly helping her split firewood in exchange for using her sharpening equipment, actually absorbing everything she was willing to teach. She was willing to teach a great deal. Knowledge, she had learned, was not diminished by being shared. Gordon had understood that. She understood it now. It was Bernard Quill who, in late January, mentioned her name to a man named Alistair Dodd. Alistair Dodd held the title of Regional Heritage Properties Coordinator for the Ontario Ministry of Culture. A long title for a job that essentially meant he was responsible for the assessment and sometimes the preservation of historically significant buildings across a very large and thinly populated stretch of northern Ontario. He was 45, methodical in the way that people who deal with old buildings tend to become. And he had been looking for someone with specific technical skills for 3 months without success. The problem was a grist mill. The Sutherland Creek Mill, a post and beam structure built in 1887 near the town of Englehart, had been identified for preservation. Its structural elements were largely sound, but the original wooden mechanisms, the pit wheel, the great spur wheel, the supporting shaft housing, had deteriorated beyond what a general contractor could assess or repair. The mill needed someone who understood historical construction methods, who could read the original structure on its own terms, who had the patience and the precision to work with century-old materials without imposing modern assumptions on them. The Toronto firm that had been the ministry's first choice had quoted a figure that made the project politically untenable. They wanted someone local, someone with real skills rather than credentials. Bernard Quill gave Alistair Dodd Violet Slade's name on a Thursday. Dodd drove out Hartwell Road on the following Monday. He arrived to find Violet in the middle of fitting a mortise and tenon joint on a piece of white oak, a commission from a furniture maker in Cobalt who was restoring a Victorian sideboard. She did not stop working when he came in. She acknowledged his presence, gestured to a stool by the stove, and finished the cuts before she turned to face him. He did not appear to find this rude. He appeared to find it reassuring. He introduced himself. He explained the mill project in the same terms he had used with the Toronto firm, the timeline, the heritage mandate, the structural complexity. He was watching her face as he spoke. She was listening in the way Gordon had listened to problems, not to the words, but to the shape of them. When he finished, she asked 3 questions. What is the original species used for the pit wheel housing? What documentation exists for the original mechanism layout? And has anyone assessed the sill plate condition on the north foundation wall? Because in a building that age on a creek, that is almost always where the decay begins. He had answers to the first 2. He did not have an answer to the third, because no one had thought to ask it. He left her with a copy of the structural assessment report and a set of photographic documentation from the ministry's last site visit. He told her the budget that was available. It was enough if managed carefully. He asked her to look at the materials and let him know. She spent 2 evenings reading the report and the photographs with the same attention she would give to a piece of timber she was preparing to work. She read, not for what the report said was wrong, but for what it revealed about the building's original intent, the logic of the design, the choices the builder had made, and what the structure had been trying to do for 130 years. On the 3rd day, she rode into Cobalt and called Alistair Dodd from the payphone outside the post office. She told him her assessment of the project and her preliminary approach to the mechanism repair. She told him what materials she would need and what the timeline would realistically look like, accounting for the fact that some of the replacement oak would need to be sourced and seasoned. She told him about the sill plate. She was confident, from the photographs, that the north wall needed to be lifted and the plate replaced before any mechanism work began, or the mechanism repair would simply transfer the structural problem rather than resolve it. She told him her price. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Slade, he said, you understand this is significant heritage work. Miss Slade," she said quietly, "and I understand what it is." Another pause, and then, "When can you go to Englehart?" She went the following week. She spent 2 days on site before committing to anything. Reading the mill the way Gordon had taught her to read a piece of lumber, looking for what it was, not what someone else had decided it was. She found the sill plate problem exactly where she had predicted it. She found, in the mechanism housing, evidence of an original design that the previous assessors had misread as deterioration. A deliberate clearance gap that allowed the shaft to flex slightly under load, a sophisticated solution for 1887 that the Toronto firm had proposed to fill and eliminate. She photographed everything. She wrote it up in a report that used the same kind of precise, specific language Gordon had taught her. Not to impress anyone, but because precision was the only honest way to describe a thing. Alistair Dodd read her report on a Friday afternoon and called her that evening. He said, "This is the most thorough site assessment I have received on a mill project in 11 years. She thanked him. She meant it, but she felt it less than she might have expected. She already knew what she had written. She had known it while she wrote it. The mill contract was formalized in March, a 6-month project, beginning when the spring thaw allowed groundwork, with a payment structure that would, when it concluded, represent more income than Violet Slade had seen in the previous 4 years combined. It would also, Alistair Dodd mentioned, be submitted as a case study to the Ministry's Heritage Trades Program, which was developing a register of certified heritage construction practitioners in the province. She was quiet for a moment after he said that. "Is there something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. "I am just thinking about a man who spent 28 years at CPR, teaching himself things that no one thought to write down, and never once put his name on anything." Dodd was quiet too for a moment. Then, "I think we should make sure your name is on this one." The reckoning, when it came, was not dramatic. It was administrative, which is the only form of reckoning that actually sticks. Reginald Oakes, solicitor, received a letter in early spring from the Ontario Heritage Trust, copied to the Ministry of Culture, requesting documentation on the disposition of the estate of Gordon Martin Slade. The letter was polite. It was also written by a government agency, which meant it was a letter that required a response. The investigation that followed was not about Violet. It was about the debt that Dale Oakes had used to claim the cottage. It turned out that the documentation supporting this claim was, on close examination, incomplete. A portion of the debt had in fact been paid down by Gordon Slade in the years before his death, and the records had been, to use the language of the final letter Violet received from the Heritage Trust's legal office, inadequately maintained. Dale Oakes did not go to prison. He was not publicly disgraced. What happened was quieter than that, and she thought, in its own way, more fitting. The solicitor's practice faced a regulatory review. The estate was reopened. A revised settlement was calculated. The cottage, it emerged, had been wrongly assigned, and a corrected deed was prepared. There was money owed to her from the original settlement. The figures, when they came, were enough that she did not have to calculate. She did not move back into the cottage. She had considered it. But the truth was that the workshop on Hartwell Road had become something the cottage had never been. Not a place she lived in by the goodwill of someone else, but a place she had made herself from the ground up, with her own hands and her own knowledge and 7 tools that had belonged to a man who had understood, without ever saying so directly, that the most lasting gift he could give her was not shelter but competence. She bought the cottage from the estate and rented it to a young family from New Liskeard who needed more space. The income helped. She kept the workshop. She expanded it the following summer, adding a full timber frame extension along the east wall, which gave her enough room for the larger commission work that was now coming in regularly from heritage properties across the district. Earl Price came out to see it when the addition was finished. He walked around the perimeter, looked at the corner joints, looked at the foundation extension, looked at the way the new roof tied into the old one. He said nothing for a long time. Then, Gordon would have said that was tidy. She understood that to be the finest thing anyone had said to her in years. On the shelf above her workbench she kept 7 things: the number 4 plane, the 8 chisels in their canvas roll, the combination square, the marking gauge and cherry wood, the rip saw, the brace, and the folding rule. They were not arranged for display. They were arranged the way you arrange tools you use every day, close to hand, in order, ready. She used Gordon's folding rule every morning. First thing, before she lit the stove, before she made tea, she would pick it up, unfold it, fold it again, and set it back down. It took 3 seconds. She did not think about why she did it. She simply knew that the day did not begin properly without it. She had not been rescued. She had been taught. And there is a difference if you sit with it long enough. We want to leave you with a question, because Violet's story is the kind that stays with you after the telling. She had a choice, in those first weeks, to take what the world offered, the inadequate settlement, the boarding house room, the diminished life, and make her peace with it. Many people would have, most people perhaps. The options that get labeled sensible are usually the ones that ask the least of you. What Violet had, what kept her at that workbench in the cold, what sent her up Hartwell Road with a folding rule and a surveyor's map and no guarantee of anything, was not courage in the storybook sense. It was something quieter and harder to name. The knowledge that she had been given something real, the refusal to let that go to waste. We think about the people in our own lives who gave us something like that. A skill, a habit of mind, a way of looking at a problem that we didn't recognize as a gift until much later when we needed it. People who taught us without calling it teaching, who left something in our hands without making a ceremony of it. Gordon Slade gave Violet Slade the knowledge of how to build. She built. Is there someone who gave you something like that? A skill, a lesson, a tool you still carry? We'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting for you right here.